Who was the woman who did the Michael Jackson conspiracy? Was it Aphrodite Jones?
Aphrodite Jones. She was an interesting lady. So she covered the Michael Jackson trial. She was in court every day. And of course, at the end of that trial, he was acquitted. Everybody knows he was acquitted. If you read the trial transcript, it's quite obvious why he was acquitted. And yet what she observed from the inside was a case which from day one was literally falling to pieces, just absolutely didn't hold water. And yet a media that every day was trying to make him look really, really guilty. And so she wrote a book after the trial called Michael Jackson Conspiracy, and she was talking about the way the media covered the case as sort of an agreement, like the media were all in cahoots. You know, you've got a case which, objectively speaking, was a catastrophe literally from day one, fell apart. And yet a media that was making it sound like he was definitely going to be convicted. And so when the acquittal came in, when the verdicts came in, there was this dissonance there between what the public were all expecting and what actually happened, because they had not been really told what was actually going on in the courtroom. So she was a very interesting person to speak to.
What was her whole opinion on the Michael Jackson case?
She came away convinced that was the right verdict. I mean, she was sat in court watching these witnesses completely fall apart. I mean, the whole case didn't... I mean, I could talk about that for 2 hours, but the whole case did not make any sense at all, the prosecution case. They had charges on the indictment which contradicted other charges on the indictment, so they couldn't both be true. You know?
Yeah.
Like,
I think the two boys, I watched one of the documentaries, the two boys that were in it, but they were actually a character witness, I think, for Michael Jackson, the case prior.
Yeah,
and they were saying he was a good guy, he was this, and then when he died, they came out and says... But I think the boy was a dancer. I think he'd been with like Britney Spears. And I think when Michael Jackson died, I don't know what happened, but it just didn't make sense to me. But they also say, I don't even know if this is true or it's fucking, but when Michael Jackson was like 8 years old, his dad took him to get him chemically castrated to keep his voice. His voice never changed.
I don't think that is true.
Yeah.
Now, you're probably talking about Leaving Neverland, that documentary.
Yeah.
So there... Again, I mean, I could literally deliver a sermon on Leaving Neverland, but there are a number of problems with those guys, and you would never know it from watching that documentary, in terms of differing versions of the stories that they've told, financial motives, parts that, you know, because when you accuse somebody of something which necessarily happens behind closed doors, you know, so what you're not talking about with Michael Jackson is a kind of a Shoebury allegation where there's this big gang of people and they're sharing boys around or whatever. What you're talking about with the Michael Jackson allegations is boys saying, we went behind a closed door and something happened. So it's impossible to verify whether that did or did not happen, because it necessarily happened in private. So the only way to verify or to try to establish the veracity of what they're saying is to take the parts that you can check and check them. And the problem with those guys, and it could be faulty memory, there's any number of explanations, but the problem is that when you do that, the bits you can check don't add up. So, for example, one of them is suing and has been suing for a number of years, and says he was abused between 1988 and 1992. In the documentary, he says that he was abused repeatedly in the Neverland train station. And the documentary, the way it's edited, certainly makes it look like he's saying that happened in the late 1980s. That train station did not exist and was not built until the mid-1990s, which is not only long after it's placed in the documentary, but also long after he says in his lawsuit that he was never abused again. So when you start looking at these inconsistencies, you know, the way that documentary presented these guys as if there was nothing wrong with their stories was not really honest. There are a number of discrepancies.
Yeah, I think he was the king of pop, wasn't he? He was the most famous person on the planet. There's always, again, people say there's no smoke without fire. I just don't know the answers to that. But when I watched the documentary, I thought the boys that were talking were full of shit. But again, there's been, in America you can buy your way out of cases and stuff as well. So but there's always going to be speculation there, isn't it? Especially when he's so high profile.
Well, you can buy in effect you can buy yourself out of a case anywhere. There's a misconception with the Michael Jackson case that he bought his way out of a criminal case, which is not true. He settled a civil case, but the criminal case continued anyway, and they just couldn't find any evidence. So the criminal case just died on its arse, basically, because the case was rubbish. It's a very complicated story, the Michael Jackson one, but it's one that I've worked on since I think I interviewed Aphrodite in 2008, and I'm still in a sense working on that story now occasionally. This morning I got an interview request by email for somebody making a documentary about Michael Jackson, but I need to find out what they're doing before I decide whether to talk to them.